Wouldn't it be great if we could add multiple user accounts under the same AWS account? This would give us so many benefits, such as easier management of users within our organization, restrictions of access to AWS services on a per user account basis, running workloads isolated per user account to prevent services being overwritten or shut by other users, one bill for all accounts under our management account, and having the confidence that when shutting down a user account, all services within this account will be shut as well. Just these rainbow, chocolate, and unicorn dreams. Hey and welcome back. In this video we'll learn how AWS Organizations works, best practices from AWS on how to organize accounts. Then we will go into the web console and set up an AWS Organizations account. And we will see how we can access the new account. By the way, AWS Organizations is free of charge. As a bonus, if you watch to the end, I'll also show you how to set up an administrative account so that you can switch into AWS Organizations accounts without requiring a password. I'll not go into service permissions in this video. I'll create a separate one that will be linked in the comment section at the end of this video once created. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Let's have a look at AWS Organizations at a glance. When you sign up, AWS will create the so-called management account, sometimes also referred to as the root account. Many people that are less familiar with AWS will start to build services into their management account, and by the way, I'm guilty of that too. This is however not ideal, as the management account has the highest level of administrative rights. In addition, when you have several users, you want to be able to give them their own account and restrict usage of services to only what they need. Same when you have different application environments such as non-prod and prod. You want to run those isolated without interference from each other. And this is where AWS Organizations comes into play. AWS Organizations is in itself a service which you can search for and activate as any other service. Once activated, you will see a root OU. OU stands for Organizational Unit. You can think about organizational units like folders into which you can organize your user accounts. In this example, we have created a sandbox OU and created two users, John Doe and Jane Doe. Both of these accounts can by default access all AWS services. But we can limit access either on the OU level for all accounts or on each account independently through SCPs, so-called service control policies. We can either allow all services by default and then explicitly block services the user should be denied access to, or we can deny access to all services by default and then whitelist the services that the user needs. AWS recommends some best practices on how to structure accounts. The recommendations, however, are more geared towards companies than individuals, so keep this in mind. You are free and encouraged to build your own structure, but the best practices give you some good ideas. This is why I cover them in this video. Most businesses have centralized services for security and infrastructure. AWS recommends that OUs should be set up for each type of infrastructure, such as, for example, networking and other IT services. And for security, OUs should be set up for log archives, read-only access, security tooling, and so on. Given that most companies have different policy requirements for prod and non-prod environments, you can then branch out into production OUs and non-production OUs, here called SDLC. So SDLC would contain any pre-production environments. Once the centralized services have been built, it's recommended to create OUs that directly relate to building or running products and services as needed. Some common patterns seen with AWS clients are sandbox OUs, which are accounts for developers to experiment with AWS services that are decoupled from the internal networks with a cap spend set on them. Workload OUs, these are accounts with external facing application services. Here you should also further expand into production and SDLC OUs. Policy staging OUs to test new access policies for new accounts. Suspended OUs that contain AWS accounts that were closed and are waiting to be deleted. Here is to note that AWS has a grace period of 90 days before deleting accounts completely. Individual business user OUs, which are used to set up business-related services such as shared file systems, for example. Exception OUs that hold AWS accounts with highly customized security rules. Deployment OUs meant for CI and CD deployments. And transitional OUs used as a temporary holding area for existing user accounts and workloads before moving them to the standard areas. AWS calls this a well-architected multi-account strategy that helps you innovate faster while ensuring that you meet your security and scalability standards. Now that we have learned how it works, let's jump into the web console and see how we can set up the accounts. Here we are on the AWS web console. As you can see, I have logged into the management account and I am on the main dashboard. Here we can click into the search bar and search for AWS Organizations and then click on the service. When you visit the page the first time, there will be an activation button. Once activated, you will see the same screen as I do with the root OU. Here we can start creating our OUs and user accounts. The OUs help us to group user accounts in a way like folders help us to group files. As you can see, I've added a few OUs already. Let's first create a new OU called Sandbox, under which we will put the counts of users that set up and test new AWS infrastructure environments. So for that we can click onto the root OU. We want to put this new OU under here, and then here we can click onto actions and then create new. And then we can call this Sandbox. And then we can click on Create Organizational Unit. Okay, and when we go back, then you will see that this Sandbox OU has been created. Now that we have this Sandbox OU created, let's create a user under this Sandbox OU. Now, here is to note that when you add a new user, the user will be automatically put under this root OU, and we will then have to move it into the Sandbox OU. So in order to create a new user, we will go up here and click on this button, Add an AWS account. And here we have two options. One is to create a new AWS account, and the other one is to invite an existing AWS account. If we would have created a few standalone accounts previously, and we want to move those standalone accounts into our AWS organizations, we can do that by inviting these accounts to join the organization, but we don't have that, so we will create a new AWS account. Let's call our account JDO, and then let's add an email address. One thing that you will notice is that AWS demands a unique email address for each account. This is fine if you set up individual user accounts, but if you set up accounts for application environments, for example, it's more convenient to have one bucket email address for all the environments. But when all email addresses have to be unique, how would we add the same email address twice? Well, AWS came up with a quirky trick. You can put the counter before the @ sign. So let me show you how this works. So let's say the user jdoe has the email address jdoe@example.com. Now let's say we have used this email address already for another account, but we want to have the same email address for this account as well. So what we can do is we can just add a +1 here, and like this we can use the same email address. So if we would want to create a third user account, then we can just add a jdoe +2, +3, +4, +5, and so on. And AWS will recognize this as the same email address. In my case, I will just add my email address that already exists. We will keep the IAM role name as is. The IAM role can later be utilized by an IAM administrative account to switch into the user account, but more on this later. So let's click on the Create AWS Accounts button. And this will now take a while to create, so I'll just be back. Okay, I'm back, and as you can see, the user account has been created. Now I have noticed that sometimes the message that the user account is being created is never disappearing. So when it takes longer than a minute, then just try to refresh your browser and you should then see the account. So let's click on this account, and then we can click onto Actions and onto Move. And then we can move this user account under the sandbox OU. Move AWS account. And now when I open this up, you see that this jdoe user account is now under our sandbox account. And with this, we have created the user account. One thing you might have noticed here is that you didn't have to provide a credit card or any other billing method. This is because the billing of all accounts within the AWS organization will go to the billing method specified in the management account. You can filter by accounts in the AWS Cost Explorer to figure out how much cost incurred on a per account basis. Great, we have now created a new account, but wait a minute, we didn't specify a password for this account. So how on earth do we access it? Well, the solution is once again not really obvious. It's to use the lost password process and reset the password. So let's just copy the email address and then log out. Sign out, and then click on the AWS Management Console again. And here we can now use our email address and click Next. And then here on the password screen, we don't have the password yet. So we will click on the Forgot Password link and email. And now we are told that a password email has been sent. Instructions have been sent to the email address associated with this Amazon Web Services account. Check that email and follow the instructions to reset your password. Okay, so we can click Done here, and then I will go into my email account and get this link. Okay, so after clicking the link in the email, we will get to this Reset Password screen, and here we can define a new password. So let's do that now. And we can click the Reset Password button. Okay, and then it says we've successfully resetted the password and we can sign in. So let's click on this button here. Okay, so here we will specify the email address again. Next, then we can put in the password. Sign in. Okay, and now we are successfully signed in to our new user account called JDoe, as you can see up here. Okay, so let's create a new service just to see what happens. So one of the simplest services to create is AWS DynamoDB. So let's type in DynamoDB and then click on it. And here we can click onto tables. And as you can see, this is empty. Now I know that this account is isolated because I have a lot of DynamoDB tables set up in my management account. That, as you can see in this JDoe account, there are no tables, which means it's isolated. So here we can click on the create table button, and then let's create a table called test table. We will create an ID as the partition key. We don't use a sort key, and then we can just click on to create table. And as you can see, the test table has been created. So let's log out of our JDoe account and go back into the management account. Sign out. AWS Management Console. Then let's log in with our root user. Okay, now we are in our management account again. If we go to DynamoDB and we click onto tables, as you can see, I have a lot of tables in here, but test table is not one of them that is in here. So we know that the table which is in our JDoe account is isolated from everything else. And that's what we wanted. So let's go back onto the main page and continue. We have now created an AWS Organizations account, and we were able to log into the account with username and password. But what is if we have to administrate these accounts? It would be pretty cumbersome if we would have to log into each account with username and password. And if these accounts belong to different users, we wouldn't want them to give us their password. The solution is to set up an IAM administrative account with which we can switch into all the user accounts without the password. And this is where our organization account access role comes into play. AWS forbids us to use the management accounts to switch into other users, so we will have to set up an IAM account with which we can do that. So let's go into IAM and set up such a user. So let's just type IAM. And then here we can click on to users. And then let's set up this user. So I will just click on to add users. And the username for this will be AWS Org admin. I will just put 1, 2, 3. Then we can click on to provide user access to the AWS Management Console. Here we want to create an IAM user. Then we want to a custom password, and we will untick users must create a new password at next sign-in. So let's click next. Permission options, add user to group, that's fine. And then here we will use the administrators group and click next. And here we can review our account details. This all looks good. Then we can say create user, and that should be it. So we can say return to users list. You haven't viewed or downloaded this user's password. If you continue, you cannot retrieve the password in future. That's okay. So let's continue. Okay. And somewhere here we should have this account, AWS Org admin 1, 2, 3. Let's click on this account. And here we have this user ID, so I will just copy and paste this into a notepad so that I have it. And then we have the username, which is this one, so I will just copy and paste this as well. And that should be it. That should be all the information that we need to log in with this user. So let's log out and log back in with this user that we have created. So I'll just click on sign out. Then we can go back to the AWS Management Console. Here we can click onto IAM user, and then we can add this ID. Next. Then we have the username that we need to add. And then we have the password. Sign in. Okay, so we have now logged in with this IAM user. Now, if I would go to DynamoDB, and onto tables, then you can see that I see all the tables which I have defined in my management account as well. Now this IAM user is basically the same like the management account, but it has a little bit more restricted access. That is the difference with it. And the good thing with the IAM account is that when we click onto here, we can now see that we have the possibility to switch roles. We didn't have this button in our management account. So let's go back to AWS Organizations. AWS Organizations. And let's go to our user JDO. So let's click on it. So here we will also copy and paste some of the settings to our notepad. So we want to have the user ID. We have the email address that we also want to copy to our notepad, and the username, and maybe the ID as well. Okay, so I believe we have now the information that we need. So let's click up here and then click on to switch role. And here I will put in the ID, and then I will put in this role name. So the organization account access role, and the display name will be JDO, and I will color this orange. And now I can click on to switch role. And bam, we are now in the JDO account and didn't have to specify any password. So let's click onto the main page. And let's now see what happens when we go to DynamoDB. And then to tables. And as you can see, we can see our test table that we have previously created, which means everything is working. We were able to log into this user account without the password. And if we go up here, we can also switch back again into our IAM user. Okay. That's it. We have seen how we can create an AWS user account. We have seen that we can access the user account with username and password. We have also seen how we can create an IAM administrative user, and with this IAM administrative user, switch into an AWS Organizations account without having to specify the password. This brings us to the end of this video. I hope you were able to follow along and set up AWS Organizations for your use case. If this video was valuable to you, I'd appreciate if you could give it a like and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. Have a good one and see you in the next video.